Here's a look at Castroville, Texas, outside San Antonio. Very picturesque, and thanks to Greg Payne for catching that footage. Let's take a look at the weather around the U.S. this afternoon. We've got a moderate risk. Tornado watches from the Louisiana coast all the way up towards Illinois. And we might as well jump to the radar. There it is, severe thunderstorm warnings, all the way up to Jackson, and then as you get into northern Mississippi, we start picking up the tornado warnings, and more of them, all the way up into Memphis. But the reason that you're not seeing any radar echoes in here, that's because we're looking at the Jacksonville radar. As you get very far away from the radar, the beam goes higher and higher, and in this area here, it's up at about 25 to 30,000 feet. So we can take a look at the actual storms. Let me set this up for you. We'll zoom in on this cluster here near Yazoo City. If we switch over to base velocity, you can definitely see the change between inbounds on the backside of that outflow boundary and outbounds. Got to consider the radar's right here, and it's viewing the line in that direction. So that's going to be the inflow on that side of the storm, and here we have outflow. Now, regular base velocity is useful for looking at the ground relative velocities, looking at the outflow, but if we want to actually see the circulations, we need to switch over to storm relative velocity. And there's what we get. It's not a huge change, but we do see a couple of areas of heightened velocity right there. That could be a potential tornadic circulation. We can switch over. Yeah, look at that. That just came in, and it looks a little bit stronger. And that's showing we have the stronger outbounds right there and the stronger inbounds right there. So the circulation, as we record this, just southeast of Yazoo City. And then further down the line, that's another suspect area right there. And we kind of look for those discontinuities and track them on a severe weather day like this. So that's what it looks like on the reflectivity. Not a lot to see on reflectivity with a big squall line like this. The velocity itself is very important. However, there are clues if we kind of remove these watches and warnings. One thing that we look for is the discreteness of the line. In other words, whether it's very two-dimensional with very little change up and down the line, or if it's broken up into what looks like individual cells. And it appears that's probably where some of that discreteness is happening, a little more down to the south, this kind of bow echo shape. You can see in between there's some weaker velocity, and we can take a look at that velocity product. There it is. Some waviness, some increased amplitudes, those higher values right there, especially right there coming into contact with the inbounds. So those are two areas we would watch. The rest of the line further down looks a little bit weaker, and the reflectivity does show it to be more two-dimensional. So really, it's these wavy structures that you have to watch out for, and also cells out ahead of the line. Now, I'm not too sure if those are going to do anything, but they definitely bear watching. If any of those can organize, they're going to be very discrete cells out there with open access to all of the moisture. Now, these cells do look very elevated. However, if any of them can organize, those would be candidates for becoming severe. So this is a good time to move on to that surface analysis. This is late morning. At that time, the squall line was still moving through western Louisiana. But this gives you a great idea of the structure of the air masses across the U.S. There's that Canadian air mass pushing into Oklahoma and Texas, rich Gulf moisture coming up into Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, and northeast of that. That's a transitional air mass from the previous cold air outbreak. And further out west, let's take a look out in the northwestern U.S., some cold air coming into Washington, British Columbia, the core of that cold air right there around Vancouver Island, where it's in the low 40s. And that cold air extends all the way down into California, Oregon, and keeping those temperatures down into the 50s and 60s in the San Joaquin Valley. So that's clearly some very cool air for this time of year. Across the Rockies, we've got a cold core low. That's it right there over western Colorado, so unstable conditions, probably some convective-driven weather, and some of that extending out into Texas, connecting with the surface system. And that's going to be connected, that stacks up with height into the colder air. You can see the thermal troughing in the thickness field right there. Let me show you one of the contours, like that purple line right there. That's a thermal trough associated with very cold air coming south in the mid-levels. And with that, snow in South Dakota and Minnesota. Some freezing rain from Minneapolis up to the UP of Michigan. Let's head out towards the Pacific and see what's going on. We saw that there was some cold weather in Alaska yesterday. Looks like some of that cold air is still moving inland towards Old Crow, Yukon, northern Yukon, western, Northwest Territories, and that's sub-zero weather. You can see -3 around Fort Yukon, and warms up a little bit as you go south. So this is kind of a transitional boundary between the colder Arctic air and the cooler maritime-influenced polar air. And then out over Canada, yeah, we're still looking at some very cold weather in the high Arctic. I think -27 at Rhea Point is about the coldest I'm seeing. So that's going to be the core of the Arctic air. And then out into the Northwest Territories, looks like another storm system lurking out there. You can see that wraparound coming into Labrador, some snow and mixed rain. And on the backside, cold air coming into Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And that's the tour. So why don't we take a look at the temperature records? Yeah, this is always my favorite part of the program. For this afternoon, no records, but we're close to records within a few degrees right there from Georgia up to Louisville. And for tomorrow, a couple lone readings down there in Florida approaching the records. And then for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, no records. That means temperatures are returning to seasonable normals across much of the country this weekend. And a quick check of conditions over in Ukraine. Quite a warm-up, 40s and even a few 50s, which I don't think we've really seen before. Temperatures are coming up. That's going to thaw that mud and make it very difficult for mechanized forces to move across the terrain. I mean, there are still roads, but a lot of the fighting is done over fields and dirt roads. And that map that you just saw was for 21Z. That was about 30 minutes ago. That was about 11 p.m. in Ukraine. You can see the daytime temperatures are even warmer, showing some near 70 conditions in Moldova and down in the south around Odessa. More of the same for tomorrow. Still remains quite cold up in the north, but it still looks like 60s and 70s through much of the week. I would think that's a welcome respite from the brutal cold that we've seen over the past few months. Looks like a little more cold air coming in towards the weekend, back down into the 40s and 30s, and probably a warm up right after that. And then, of course, the other question, precip. Precip just compounds that mud. And we can see some rain bands moving across the country, mostly in the north, through the next couple of days. Those amounts, purple, accumulated. Yeah, that's a substantial amount of rain. That's over an inch, maybe an inch and a half. And then looks like another shot coming in later next week. And then we check in on Big Rig Steve. He's located in northeastern Oregon, heading for Atlanta. That's going to be his location right there, coming through the mountains. And that's a pretty scenic view heading eastbound there on that interstate. Looks like some cumuliform clouds, some shallow convection. Looks like they spread out into these middle layers, maybe up at about 10 or 15,000 feet, that looks kind of diffuse, probably some rain and snow way up there. Let's check out the maps and see what it looks like on the charts. So he's located about right there. The first thing that we see on the chart is a cold air advection zone. That cold air that we talked about around Vancouver Island continuing to spread towards the southeast. You get that strong air mass modification from the ground up. The warm ground warms it from below, and you get those steep lapse rates, and that favors cumuliform clouds. And we'll go over to Pivotal Weather and look at their forecast skew-ts. This is going to be about where he is right there. You can see that steep lapse right there. That cold air mostly centered at about 7 to 10,000 feet. Westerly at 20 knots there, flowing in from the Pacific, and it's being warmed from the bottom up. And you can see that lower part of the sounding looks steeper than the dry adiabatic lapse rate. And on the satellite, looks like a wave moving through that area. That's it right there, kind of a comma shape out in that region there. Let's take a look at the upper air chart. And there's what we look like at the present time. Looks like one wave located here, another up here, and Steve is right in between. Overall, this is probably an area of ascent, and we kind of saw that on the satellite. Further down to the south, some waves moving into the southern U.S., helping to support the steeper lapse rate and the mid-level lift near that MCS. And here comes another wave on the backside. So this is capable of producing weather as it moves into Texas and Oklahoma. The air mass is rather dry, so I don't know if we're going to see much at the surface, but I would expect at least some clouds as that moves south. And there you can see it diving into Dallas, Waco there by tomorrow morning, and the other wave moving on up into Pennsylvania, and it looks more channeled. That's more indicative of a jet with a jet max right there in eastern Ohio. Let's look at the overall large-scale pattern. Still looks progressive. Series of large-scale troughs. Looks like 4 of them, maybe 2 long waves. And then going through the weekend, there's one wave up to the north. Here's another one. And these are smaller scale troughs that just kind of move west to east. If they're linked up with low-level moisture, those will produce clouds and rain. Checking back in on our squall line. Yeah, I know a lot of you would rather see a live webcast. I will tell you we are pretty close to figuring out how to do something like that. We are getting fiber in our area very shortly. The DSL is not really capable of doing much more than 480p here. So we are trying to figure out some plans for the next few weeks for at least our supporters, and we'll have more information for you in the next couple weeks. Anyway, a lot of tornado warnings out there in central Mississippi, starting with the Jackson area. Jackson under a tornado warning. Now that is going to be broadcast media confirmed. And you don't really see that very well in the reflectivity data. But let's go over to the storm relative velocity. So we rolled this back to 2137 UTC. You're going to watch this area right here. Doesn't look like anything too unusual. Switch over to reflectivity. A little bit of a kind of a bowing shape there. And as we move forward, you can see how rapidly this develops. That's the circulation there, pretty much right over Jackson, Mississippi. And there's the roads. So that's going to be the southeast corner of town. The reflectivity, yeah, looks can be deceiving. Just a little bit of a bow shape there. If all you had is reflectivity, you would probably completely miss that. And that's likely what happened with a lot of outbreaks back in the 80s. One that comes to mind is Sweetwater, Texas, back in 86. That tornado was missed The radar operators could not really see that because all they had to go with was an image like this. But picking up that velocity, let's track the rest of that little circulation. Moves out there towards this town. I think that's Flowood. Yeah, Flowood. Okay. And then eventually it gusts out and then we lose definition. And here's another circulation. That's probably the one we're watching at this time. Not really doing much at the moment, but that does have potential. And you can see that little bowing shape still hanging on at the junction between these two tornado warnings. So quite a lot going on in Mississippi at this hour, and more tornadic storms near Memphis. Let's switch over to the Memphis radar. Looking at a couple of tornadic cells from Memphis down into Mississippi. Doesn't look like anything suspect on the reflectivity. Maybe a hint of a hook shape right there. But switching over to the storm relative velocity, yeah, now we can really see the strong signatures. This is, got to consider the radar is way up here. Looking at the circulation from the northwest. And this is showing very strong outbounds and weak inbounds, but still, that is rotational shear right there. So they have a tornado warning out for that circulation. And then further down the line, this looks like a dissipating circulation near the state line. So now you have some tips and tricks on how to monitor this MCS as it continues moving east during the evening. And a good place, if you don't know of any good sites, is College of DuPage Weather. Just go to weather.cod.edu, and they've got a ton of great products. Let's take a look at our forecast. The all-seeing, all-knowing GFS forecasting that squall line to continue moving eastward through the evening, reaching Atlanta sometime around midnight. Storms likely will continue to be severe as they move through Alabama, and then maybe some weakening as they go further east as we lose the afternoon heating, and that tempers the instability somewhat. Trailing that, a cold front. Warm front up to the north, precip changing over to rain in Michigan, and on the other side, cold air advection sweeping snow into Iowa, Chicago, and Milwaukee tomorrow morning. It looks like a pretty strong storm moving through the northern part of Michigan right there around Mackinac Straits. Looks like some very strong winds there. Then going into Thursday, looks like a pretty quiet day. And then Friday, high pressure, some return flow starting to set up in Texas, probably a frontal boundary right through here, and probably some elevated storms developing in western Oklahoma. Then a quiet weekend, another push of cold air coming south around Monday. Maybe some better storm chances there in Kansas with the low-level jet starting to get established. Also looking a bit stormy out there in the central Rockies. And looks like an MCS possible by early next week, affecting that same area of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana once again. And then a good chunk of cold air coming south late in the week. And that clears us out for probably several days. And that looks like a reinforcing shot. And that's your forecast. And that concludes our Forecast Lab program for Wednesday. I want to thank our new Patreon supporters, Chris Kegley and Shara Kay. Thank you very much for your contribution. That will definitely help keep this program going. And hopefully we can continue to improve it and add more features and segments. I'll leave you now with some more of that footage from Castroville. Thanks to Greg for the footage, and we'll see everybody back here on Friday. Take care. Bye-bye.